So, I'd like to introduce you now to Trevor Jones. Step forward, Trevor. Trevor is the chief pilot, chief flying instructor of the Royal Aero Club. He sits in an office downstairs and gets flooded with paperwork, and every now and then he can't stand it anymore and he takes off for a busman's holiday to fly aeroplanes and get involved in paperwork generated by people overseas who command him to fly through their airspace in a certain manner. Some of the flights are lengthy, over water, PNRs, point of no return, etc. All sorts of calculations go through his head. All sorts of distractions occur.
Very much for the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon. I'm going to talk about a couple of different things. Firstly, planning some flights. Secondly, some of the human factors situations that we have to consider. As Brian's alluded to, flying around in different countries has its difficulties as well. Apart from all of that, what I want to share with you is just the experience of being able to fly light aeroplanes and some of the different sites that you do get to see. All of these flights have been on small aeroplanes, a couple of single engine aeroplanes and a couple of twin engine aeroplanes. But first off, I've got a map of Australia up there, so why is that there, I see you ask. And that is that the first flight that I did was actually to New Zealand. But if you have a look at the scale of the map and the ocean and New Zealand there, flying from the west coast to the east coast is actually a bigger job than flying from Australia to New Zealand. The difficulty comes as soon as you leave the east coast, you're flying over water. And for the first 2 hours of this flight, it was just 2 hours completely over water without seeing anything, and aiming for a very small island, Lord Howe Island. So we, in 2006, took a Mooney from Jandakot to North Shore Aero Club in New Zealand to be part of around the New Zealand air race. And our first point of call after the East Coast was Lord Howe Island. It's a fantastic place to approach, especially after you have only been seeing water and clouds for a couple of hours, to see those two peaks in the distance. And that's basically all of Lord Howe Island. It's a fantastic place to go to. Right in the middle down there is where the runway is. It is a reasonable strip there, however, quite exposed out into the middle of the ocean, and you do have to consider the weather conditions, the wind conditions out there before you go. Planning that for a 2-hour flight isn't too bad, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Just as a point of interest, right in the distance is a rock called Ball's Pyramid, which is the edge of a volcanic crater, and it's just that piece of rock that remains standing there. From Lord Howe Island we went to Norfolk, and Norfolk is quite an interesting approach in the fact that the runway elevation is 200 feet. From the threshold to the approach path to the edge of the island is about 600 metres, and then 200 feet down to the water. So the approach is quite interesting going into there, and quite daunting. Norfolk Island is several hundred miles north of New Zealand, so it was directly from Norfolk Island into the North Island of New Zealand that we headed. And this was the type of weather that we found at New Zealand. Along the way it was beautiful. We could see some clouds in the distance, and we probably saw the long white cloud, but they looked like pretty low grey awful clouds when we got there, and not very nice flying conditions. I apologise to any New Zealanders here, but these were the flying conditions for most of the time that we were there. So for a first overseas sort of trip, considerations that we did have to think about, we are going out of the country, we are leaving the country, going into a different country, so you do have to go through customs, immigration, quarantine, and all of those sort of things need to be organised first. Probably with an organisation such as Qantas, they've got a department that looks after that, but when you're an individual pilot in a small aeroplane, phoning up all of these different departments and trying to get the right permits, the correct permits for the correct times, is quite an amount of work. They also want down to the, half an hour, within half an hour of when you're going to arrive, so that they can organise all of the officials to be there for you at the other end. So it does take a little bit of messing around. Again, I'm just comparing the scale here, because the first overseas trip going to New Zealand compared to my second trip was coming from the States to Australia is quite a different thing. The New Zealand trip, as I said, was in a Mooney. It had standard fuel tanks. We didn't have to arrange for ferry tanks or anything like that. Probably the longest trip over water was about 4 hours, which is still very daunting. However, starting to plan a trip like this one opens up a lot more problems. Pilots have been ferrying aeroplanes from the United States for quite some time. I'd never done it before, so finding out the information for the first time takes a lot of digging around. When the aeroplane's prepared, they know that we have to have extra fuel tanks in there. In fact, the flight for this aeroplane, this was a Cirrus, another single engine aeroplane. We had to carry an extra 200 litres of fuel, so it was quite a bit overweight. The distance from the States to Hawaii is just over 2,000 miles. So for a single engine aeroplane to make that, it does need to be fitted with ferry tanks. When I went over to get this aeroplane, it was actually based in Florida, where it was purchased from, so we picked it up from Florida, took it to California, where it was fitted out with the ferry tanks. The FAA is quite used to doing these sorts of permits and paperwork as well, so we had some very helpful officials there, and the aeroplane was ready to ship from California to Australia. Unfortunately, the weather didn't play the right sort of game with us, and we sat on the ground in California for nearly 2 weeks and decided that it just wasn't going to get any better. So we had to leave the aeroplane and plan to go back a couple of months later to get it. What we actually did was got a US ferry pilot when the weather looked good to take it from California to Hawaii, and we went back to Hawaii a couple of months later to pick it up. From Hawaii, we went directly south to an island called Kirimatati. It's locally known as Christmas Island, not to be confused with our Christmas Island. But that trip from Hawaii to just above the equator was about 8 hours. So 8 hours over water for the first time I'd flown this aeroplane in 3 or 4 months. It was the first time we'd taken it off with the ferry tanks. As I mentioned, it was overweight. We were about 600 kilos overweight, which was permissible. For single engine aeroplanes, they allow 25% over the gross to take off. So we took off 600 kilos overweight and headed off for an 8-hour trip over the water. To be welcomed at Christmas Island, this was their international terminal, this was their immigration, this was their quarantine. But a very interesting place. Probably the only opportunities that people would get to go to a place like this is on such a ferry trip, so it was great to see it. This island was developed in the 50s by the British, who had some nuclear tests in the area and were based out of Kirimatati. I think some of the avgas drums that we'd used were actually left over from the 50s as well. From Kirimatati we went to Western Samoa. I've got another map of that a little bit later on. Western Samoa to New Caledonia. And this is a sort of an easy part of the trip because you do actually fly over some other islands on that trip. From Western Samoa to New Caledonia, you do fly over a lot of islands in the Fijian group, so it's quite interesting seeing all of those. Noumea was a beautiful place, and some of the things that you can see from the air, it's just unique, the views that pilots are able to get, so that's why I'm interested in sharing photos with you all as well. The next trip that I was asked to do was picking up a Vulcanair, which is the company that took over from Partnavia. The Vulcanair or Partnavia are built in Naples in Italy. So this was a purely or mainly overland sort of flight. The difference with this flight was it passed through so many countries, and probably every stop that we've got there is in a different country. So every country you go into, you have to have a different permit, you have to have different types of paperwork, you have to deal with different officials. This aeroplane was bought brand new from the factory, and when the owner bought it, he bought the aircraft handbook into me, and we worked out a bit of a flight route based on what it said in the pilot's operating handbook, saying that this aeroplane would do 170 knots. So we worked out all of our stops, we got all of our permits, landing permits, working out where the fuel was going to be based on 170 knots. And the first day we flew the aeroplane, it actually did 142 flat out. So along the way, we were organising new permits and dealing with different authorities the whole time. The really strong message that I got from this one was we did have a ground handling agent. So this a guy in London who organises permits for jets or for private aeroplanes organised the permits for us, and we were lucky enough that we were able to ring him up when we got to our destination and say we can't go to the next place the next day, we're going to go to XYZ, and by the next morning he would have the permits to us. So it was completely invaluable having somebody on the ground being able to do that. But of course on such a trip, flying through so many different countries, lots of language barriers to overcome. Even though English is the international aviation language, it's not necessarily that on the ground. I must say though that all of the air traffic controllers we dealt with were very clear, very easy to understand, and very helpful. We got to see some amazing sights flying over Dubai for the tallest building in the world. We were at 4,000 feet and that building's 3,000 feet. So fantastic viewpoint. And again, something you can only do in a light aircraft. It's amazing. The haze isn't my bad photography, it's sand around Dubai. The islands that they've made there, again, something that is a unique viewpoint from a light aeroplane. And those of you who have recently tried to fly over the top of Perth Airport, we got a clearance to fly straight over the top of Dubai Airport, and it was really easy. Different countries, this is in Oman, but different countries have different fuel tax levies. Oman is very cheap for fuel, so there's a lot of freighter type aeroplanes that go in there for cheap fuel. The landing spot before this was in Bahrain, where they, as you know, have lots of oil wells and things. However, we paid $6 a litre for avgas there. When we got 600 litres, it was a little bit of a hefty bill. They also charged us $1,000 to land there. They charged $800 for handling fees, and the hotel was just over $500 a night as well. So it isn't necessarily a cheap business. From Oman, we went to Mumbai. We went to Mumbai accidentally. Mumbai was actually our alternative, and along the way, doing some calculations, we worked out that we weren't going to have enough fuel to get to our destination, so we decided to go to Mumbai. So about an hour out of Mumbai, we started to make radio calls to let them know that we wanted to go to our alternate, and nobody was replying. And we just kept making calls and kept making calls. It was extremely busy trying to get into air traffic control. It was also quite confusing because us having a Victor Hotel registration and India having Victor Juliet and Victor Golf registrations, some of the calls got quite mixed up. However, we tried for about an hour to get onto ATC to say that we intended to land at Mumbai and didn't get anything. So about 15 minutes out, I was starting to get a little bit worried about this. We definitely didn't have enough fuel to go to our original destination from here. And just as I was starting to panic a little bit more, they started to talk to us. And I've since found out that they have a system in India, and probably where there are very busy airways, where they prioritise traffic. Somebody who's an hour out, they're not going to talk to. So if you're 10 or 15 minutes out, you will be able to get through and they'll look after you. They weren't quite sure what type of aeroplane that we were. They told us that we were following a helicopter going into the airport, and they asked if our minimum speed could be 150 knots. Well, unfortunately, our maximum speed couldn't even be 150 knots. Anyway, we landed there safely. They put us over in the executive jet area. This airport charges $30 for landing, and the handling fees here were $300, so that was very reasonable. All good facilities as well. This is the Mumbai Fire Department. Something else that was quite interesting from the ground in Mumbai is that there's lots of birds around the airport. And all the way up the main runway, there's little tents with men sitting in there. They sit there the whole day, and they've got a box of firecrackers. And every 2 minutes or so, they'll get out and they'll chuck a firecracker in the air and scare the birds away from the runway. This is Calcutta. So we flew across India from Mumbai to Calcutta. I'd never been to India before, and I hadn't really had any interest to do it. I was quite surprised going across country how sparse the countryside was, how few people you actually see on the ground. It's only the major centres that are very, very crowded. And unfortunately in this flight they put us over near some aeroplanes that were in the process of being scrapped, so that was a little bit off-putting. Some of the conditions that you see overseas can be quite different. If you have a look, we're getting fuel out of a drum through a plastic garden hose. You can probably see that there's a bit of a thunderstorm building up in the background. This is actually in Indonesia, and I'm sorry I can't quite remember the year, but there was some volcanoes, active volcanoes at the time, and I think that the thunderstorm and the volcanoes are actually mixed up in the background there. So we did want to get going and get out of there. There were a few sparks jumping off that plastic hose as the guy was pumping the fuel in, so a little bit off-putting. I've included this trip because a ferrying trip by definition is moving an aeroplane from one place to another place. You'll notice almost straight across Australia on this trip, but there's quite a few stops there. The reason there's quite a few stops there was this was in a Boeing Stearman. We're planning to do 75 knots at the best, and we had to stop every 2 hours for fuel. But again, the viewpoints from a wonderful aeroplane of some magnificent scenery was just made this trip an adventure. I left out the ones where we might have been a little bit lower. And some of the refuelling facilities are quite interesting along the way. This is at Nullarbor Station. There's actually a reasonable strip at Nullarbor Station, and they actually have quite an active joy flight industry there when the whale season's on, so they do cater for light aeroplanes. There's not much scenery here, but there's a little bit of a story. This is at Renmark in South Australia. While I was organising the fuel, I tried to make the fuel stops as even as possible so that we could carry out the trip efficiently. Renmark did have avgas in the Ursus, so I called the guys up and I said, can we get some fuel there? And they said, oh yeah, no problem. I said, will you be here on Friday? And he said, oh no, we're only here on Sundays for the gliders. So I said, can I get some fuel? And he said, oh yeah, that's fine. All you have to do, you go to the second post from the left, and there's a key there, that opens up the Bowser. And I said, do you want a credit card number or something so that we can pay for it? And he said, oh no, just leave an envelope underneath the shed, we'll get that. So we went in there, got the fuel, left some cash for them, and that was it. But again, very helpful people, making it very easy, something that the aviation community does open up for us. once again, I can only say that the visual opportunities we get from light aircraft are just fantastic, and being able to see weather close up, especially with an open cockpit, does give us an appreciation for it. So I've come back to the American map again. The next trip that I did was in a Baron. The Baron, again, I picked up from California, and that was planned to come back to Perth via Hawaii, Western Samoa, and then straight to Australia. So 3 stops, quite easy. Except that most of the flights, most of the durations were around the 14-hour duration for the flight. It's 2,200 miles from California to Hawaii, and then 2,300 to Samoa, and then I think it was a short stop to Australia after that. Had the opportunity to go over on a 380 as well, so that was nice. And I started to talk earlier on about the weather conditions. So here we've got a weather service from the United States showing the west coast of the States and going into Hawaii. And in between there's 8 different weather zones. When you're planning to take off, you have to think about the weather 12, 14 hours in advance, what's going to happen along the way, and the average needs to be that you have a tailwind. If the average isn't a tailwind, most ferry pilots don't take off. There is a very good service for this that the American people have, and you get very accurate winds. Most of the time for light aircraft, they do ferries between 5,000 and 10,000 feet, and the winds on the day that I went were favourable at 6,000 feet, so I went at 6,000 feet. This is the actual aeroplane. It was a little bit of an older Baron, but in very good condition. The person that bought it wanted old-fashioned gauges and low hours, and we found an aeroplane for him that did it. So a little bit of an idea of how this aeroplane's fitted out. The fuel tanks, the extra fuel tank, this was an extra 200 US gallons in the back, went from the front seats to halfway through the cabin. There was also an extra 30-gallon fuel tank in the nose of the aeroplane. Seats have to be taken out, of course, but they were able to be stowed in the aeroplane to come back with it. And a reasonably nice office to be working in. It's a little bit difficult to see, but on top here is another unit that needs to be installed for the ferry, which is a HF radio. The HF radio is the hardest job while you're doing a ferry flight. There's a lot of noise going on the whole time. It's extremely difficult to hear and understand what they want. There's a time delay, so it's very, very wearing to use the HF radio. The first time I had to use that, I was getting a clearance, and the clearance that they gave me was via latitudes and longitudes. So they gave 8 latitudes and longitudes in the clearance, and I had to read that back, and I got a number wrong in it. So they had to read the whole thing again, and I had to read the whole thing back again until I got the numbers correct. This is heading towards the coast of the United States. The place that I took off is called Merced in California. It's about an hour inland, but where that cloud is where the water started. And I was actually quite glad that the cloud was there. It didn't look as if I was flying over nothing. When you fly directly over water, over nothing, it is very daunting. And between the United States and Hawaii, there's absolutely nothing else. The fuel tanks did have a bit of a system that you have to learn how to use. I can't remember any of it now, but believe me, I did concentrate when I was being shown how to use it. And this is inside the office. So the fuel tanks were a little bit awkward to reach from around the back of me. For the first 2 or 3 times that I changed to the ferry tank, the left engine failed for 2 or 3 minutes. That was each time, so that was a little bit scary as well. But that sort of worked itself out eventually. Just take a note here. We've got a clear plastic tube. There's the fuel gauge. So the most reliable fuel gauge. That was the best thing to have. I hope none of my students are here, but this is my flight planning. The plan started off okay and clear, but by the time I had some scribblings and fuel calculations and frequency transfers, Latin longitudes to enter into the GPS, it did get quite busy. 14 hours seems like a long time to be in a small aeroplane, but you do get very, very busy. Looking at the fuel gauges, looking at the fuel gauges, looking at the fuel gauges, and then doing a few calculations along the way.
When you started out across the water between California and Hawaii, did your engines go into auto rough?
It seemed it, yes. Any little noise you definitely notice as soon as you go over the water. Next couple of slides are again just some unique sort of scenery that you get on this type of flight. Because Hawaii was 14 hours away, and because I had a little problem with the battery before I left California, I left a little bit late, so I arrived in Hawaii at night. The island of Hilo is a volcano. It's a 14,000 foot volcano. So somewhere behind that cloud is a 14,000 foot volcano. So I landed at Hilo at about 8 o'clock in the evening, got a hotel, did all the clearances the next day. My objective was to have a day off, then get up about 2 o'clock the next morning and take off at 3 o'clock or so in the morning and go to Western Samoa. When I got to the aeroplane at 3 o'clock in the morning, tried to start the engines and I had the same flat battery. So there wasn't anybody at the airport to help me until 8 o'clock the next day. I didn't want to take off at 8 o'clock the next morning and fly for 14 hours and land at night at the next place. So I actually stayed awake during the day then, left at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, flew for another 14 hours and landed at 6 o'clock the next morning. So my first sight of the volcano was getting on top of the clouds. So again, that's a volcano. It's a little bit difficult to get the scale of it, but you may just be able to see on top there's some observatories, so you can get an idea of the size of that mountain, but again, pointing up 14,000 feet. Some unique scenery again. This flight lasted for about an hour and a half before it got dark, so I decided to take a few photos before it got dark. But just absolutely unique and beautiful. And then landing the next morning at this island, which is Pago Pago in Western Samoa. The reason I didn't want to land at night there, I'd been there previously. I still don't know the answer to this. I don't know if there's lights at the runway or not. The controller is actually in Samoa itself rather than American Samoa. Which is about 60 miles away. There's no avgas there, so you have to go to this island, but I don't know how they get the lights on, if they've got lights, so I wanted to land there during daylight. From Pago Pago, it was directly to Gold Coast Airport, but Pago Pago itself is another beautiful island, and lush, lovely colours. But as I said before, on the Cirrus flight, at least this time when you're flying over the ocean, you get to see some islands, or at least somewhere where you've got some chance of being able to land. I didn't really realise there was that many islands in Fiji. There's over 100 islands in the Fijian group. This is actually just past New Caledonia, but a very unique sunset from this point of view. I'm an aviation buff, so I did get to see something else, well, not quite unique, but certainly very interesting, seeing Connie firing up at Broken Hill. So that was the trip from the United States back in the Barron. I've since also done a trip in a 182 from Singapore to here. Normally, a 182 would be thinking about flying to Albany or Geraldton or something. Singapore, after trips like this, were quite easy, but again, we had to do some 4 and 5 hour flights over water, dealing with a number of different countries to be able to get through. Probably the worst experience on that trip was sitting in the aeroplane at Broome when it was 42 degrees for nearly 50 minutes waiting for the authorities to come and stamp our passports and say we could get out of the aeroplane. So I have been very lucky to be able to do a few things like this. This is the next one. Many of you may know the M22, a Mooney Mustang that is based at Jandakot. The owner's moved to Spain, and he's since moved from Spain to South Africa. But at the moment, the aeroplane's having a new engine put in it and new avionics put into it, and we're going to fly from Perth to Cape Town. He's decided to go this route. When he first bought the aeroplane to Australia, he flew from Europe to Australia, so he's done the first leg, Europe to Australia. He's doing the rest of the world and ending up in Cape Town. So this again is going to take a reasonable amount of planning. It's going to be quite interesting seeing some weather phenomena and whether the drums of fuel are actually on these islands, whether those islands are actually there. Now I'm sure the islands are, but finding those and checking out the fuel situation is going to be very interesting. So thank you very much for listening carefully this afternoon. Are there any questions from anybody?
Tropical convergence, Trevor. Did you experience it?
We didn't. Any time we've crossed the equator, you plan to do it at the right time. There are just times that you can't fly light aeroplanes in those sort of latitudes, so it's always planned around the time of year and the weather.
Trev, your ferry tanks, do you have a dump valve if you get a problem that you can get rid of some fuel? I was thinking also about the Barron, you know, I would imagine it probably wouldn't fly very well on one when it was full of fuel, would it?
No, it didn't. So no to both questions, Dick. No, there isn't a dump valve. No, that aeroplane didn't perform very well at all on one engine. We did actually, in the Cirrus, have to turn around and land just after takeoff, so we had to land the Cirrus 600 kilos overweight, which probably isn't recommended. However, aeroplanes have got a lot of safety margin in them, so that was possible. Yes?
What special insurance requirements have you got to meet, especially for single engine over water like you've done?
The insurance companies required an amount of experience with overwater flying. One of my first commercial jobs was flying to the Abrolhos Islands, so I had about 400 hours of overwater flights. I was able to quote, built up off half-hour flights. They didn't know the difference. On the Cirrus, they did ask how many hours on type I had. I had 2, and they put it down, and that was okay. The aircraft insurance itself, I've seen between $10,000 and $15,000 for the period of the ferry that the insurance company will charge. And again, the pilot's experience sort of goes into that as well.
Do you have problems in obtaining avgas? I know you probably make arrangements, but it could be getting harder to find.
Over the Pacific, it's reasonably easy. Going into Bahrain, every place I suppose is different. You do have to find out whether avgas is available or not. The flight that we're planning around from Japan to Alaska, the reason we're not going through Russia is that avgas isn't available in Russia. So yes, we do have to plan for it. Yes, we do have to plan to pay a premium for it. And $6 or $8 a litre when you're in the middle of nowhere isn't that much anyway. Yeah.
What weather conditions like on that particular flight?
This one's still in the planning stage at the moment. I am yet to find some reasonable information about it. I'm sure that there'll be a very small corridor of time that the weather will be appropriate. I'm also sure that the day before, if we haven't got a perfect forecast, it won't be happening. The good thing about doing it in summertime is that it'll be very light. We have 20 hours of light in these sort of latitudes, so we can take off late in the afternoon and plan to land late at night, or vice versa as well.
Do you have to take a dozen different currencies worth to pay for all this stuff?
A lot of it can be dealt with first. Again, if we've got a handling agent, the handling agent will do that. Some people do just want cash. In Bahrain, we had to pay $3,600 in US dollars to pay for cash there. Most places do have cards though, and if the handling agent's done it, then they've already put it in their fees. Yes, you do have to carry a dinghy. That's a requirement. The FAA won't issue permits unless you've got the correct survival equipment there. So the types of survival equipment is the dinghy, is the life jacket, is the fluorescent lights there, EPIRB. I carry 2 EPIRBs, I carry 2 or 3 GPSs in case one goes. We carry food, water. We need food and water on for the duration of the flight anyway, so a little bit extra for in case of an emergency is useful as well. But basically on the flight planning form, if you haven't got the emergency equipment, they won't give you a clearance.
What sort of clothing can you wear on the overwater flights? Do you have to wear?
I do wear normal clothing. I have heard of people that wear immersion suits. I've also heard of people that don't want to wear immersion suits because they don't want to be bobbing around. They want to be bumped off if they do end up in the water. It's a matter of personal, and sorry, it isn't flippancy.